All right, buckle up because today's deep dive is going to be a wild ride through the evolution of web development. We're talking about how we went from those blinky text only websites to, well, everything you're using on the internet right now. Seriously, right? Like, imagine explaining this to someone back in, say, 1989. Streaming services, online gaming, this very podcast, their heads would explode. So we're going to break it all down, the big leaps, the aha moments, the tech that changed everything. And hopefully by the end, you'll be able to look at the web and be like, yeah, I actually get how that stuff works. And every good origin story needs a big bang moment, right? And for the web, that moment was 1989, Tim Berners-Lee unleashes HTML on the world.
Huge moment. Imagine, before HTML, the internet was like this giant library with no organizing system whatsoever. Just mountains of information, impossible to find anything. HTML gave us the structure, the linking ability, the foundation for a global information system.
Okay, so we've got the language of the web, HTML. But let's be real, those early websites, pretty basic. Like, imagine reading a digital pamphlet. Informative, sure, but not exactly a thrilling user experience.
Like, you couldn't really do much. It was static. And that's where JavaScript comes in 1995, and boom.
The web learned to dance.
Exactly. Suddenly, web pages could hire ACT to you.
Yeah.
Click a button, something changes on the page without a full reload. It's hard to imagine now, but back then, that was revolutionary.
Totally. It's like the web went from black and white to full color almost overnight. But while all this cool stuff was happening on the front end, the part you see behind the scenes, we needed something to handle all the data, the logic, all the invisible stuff that makes websites actually work. Enter PHP. I'll admit, I kind of took PHP for granted early on, but it was the engine powering a huge chunk of the early internet. What made it so impactful?
PHP was this perfect storm of, simplicity and power. Easy to learn, worked well with HTML, and crucially, it was open source.
Yeah.
Anyone could use it, modify it.
So it spread like wildfire.
Exactly. And because it was so accessible, it meant a lot of people were building websites with it, which just made it even more popular.
It was like the Swiss Army knife of early web development. But even with these tools, building complex websites was still, well, not complex.
Like trying to build a skyscraper with just hand tools. Possible. Sure. But probably not the best idea.
And that takes us to the next phase where things get really interesting. The rise of frameworks and a whole new focus on user experience. Okay, so we've laid the foundation, right? HTML, JavaScript, PHP, the early web, up and running. But anyone who's ever tackled a DIY project knows things can get messy fast. And for web developers back then, a lot of time was spent basically reinventing the wheel with each new project. Enter frameworks. Think of them like pre-built Lego sets for websites. They give you structure, best practices, and let developers focus on the unique stuff. Our sources point to Ruby on Rails, which came out in the mid-2000s, as a real game changer. What was so special about it? Why was everyone suddenly obsessed with Ruby on Rails?
It wasn't just that Rails, as it's often called, made building web apps faster. It was the whole philosophy behind it. This idea of convention over configuration, basically. Rails had strong opinions about how things should be done. And for a lot of developers, that was actually really freeing.
So instead of endlessly debating the best way to structure your code, you could just follow Rails conventions and actually build stuff.
Exactly. Like having a really, really opinionated but brilliant architect guiding your every decision. It might not be the perfect fit for every project, but when it clicked, magic.
Right. It's like those chefs who are like, this is the only way to make a true bolognese. And you know what? They're usually right. But Ruby on Rails wasn't the only framework making waves. Our sources also talk about Python and its trusty sidekick, Django.
Oh yeah, Python, with its focus on readability. Like you can almost read Python code like plain English. It's that clear. And Django came with this batteries included approach, tons of pre-built tools and features.
So it was like the well-equipped general contractor of web frameworks ready to tackle any job, big or small.
Perfect analogy. And while all this was happening on the back end, the part you don't see the front end was getting a makeover too.
Oh yeah. CSS, which controls how websites look, started getting really sophisticated.
Right. We could finally make websites that didn't look like they were designed in the 90s.
No offense to the 90s aesthetic, of course.
Of course, of course. But the real game changer for user experience was AJX. Asynchronous JavaScript and XML. Sounds complicated, but bear with me.
We're all about demystifying the jargon here.
Appreciate it. So before AJAX, every time you interacted with a website, clicked a button, submitted a form, whatever, the entire page had to reload.
Which, let's be honest, was kind of clunky, especially as websites were getting more complex and handling more data.
Exactly. AJAX let parts of a web page update without that full refresh. Think about scrolling through your social media feed today. new content just loads seamlessly, right?
Right. It's like magic, but it's actually AJX doing its thing.
Exactly. Ajax made the web feel more like an app-responsive dynamic.
Yeah.
And this was just the beginning. This era saw jQuery, AngularJS, React, Vue.js, a whole flood of tools that let developers build richer, more interactive experiences.
It's amazing how these seemingly small changes, like no more full-page reloads, had such a huge impact on how we use the web. But of all those innovations, one that really stands out is React, developed by Facebook. What made React so influential? Why was it such a big deal?
React introduced this idea of component-based architecture, basically building websites with Lego blocks. Each component is a self-contained chunk of code, like a button, a form, a newsfeed item.
So instead of building a website as this one massive tangled mess of code, you break it down into smaller, reusable pieces.
Exactly. Makes it way easier to manage, update, and wrap your head around.
React made web applications more organized, efficient, scalable, a true game changer. And this is where things get really interesting. Because as the web grew, so did the demands on those often invisible backends. We needed more power, more efficiency, new ways to handle all this complexity.
Like building a car that can go 200 miles per hour, you need a really powerful engine and some serious engineering under the hood.
And that takes us to the next chapter of our story, the rise of the backend powerhouses. All right, so we've journeyed from those static pages of the early web to, well, a crazy, dynamic, interconnected digital world powered by all this complex front-endy back-end technology. So, where do we even go from here? What's next for the web?
If there's one thing we've learned from the history of web development, it's that predicting the future is a fool's game. But we can definitely spot some trends, right? See what's gaining traction and make some educated guesses.
Right, and our sources mention a few big ones. One language that comes up at LOT is Python. We talked about it earlier with Django, but it seems like Python is everywhere these days.
Yeah, Python has exploded in popularity recently, and for good reason. It's versatile, pretty easy to pick up, especially compared to some other languages, and huge EE+. It's got this massive ecosystem of libraries and frameworks, so you're not reinventing the wheel for every project.
So you're saying if you had to bet on one language to rule them all?
I'm not saying that, but Python would be a good bet, especially since it's become so central to data science and machine learning. And that stuff is only going to become more important in web development as we move forward.
Makes sense. The web is all about data now.
Okay.
What about Ruby on Rails? Is it still kicking around?
Oh, absolutely. It might not be the hot new thing anymore, but Rails is still super solid for certain types of web applications, especially startups that need to get up and running quickly. There's a reason it became so popular in the first place. It's just a really well-designed framework for certain use cases.
Like that classic car that's still a joy to drive.
Exactly. And then you've got Go Google's baby. Go is all about speed, efficiency, concurrency. Basically handling tons of stuff happening at the same time without breaking a sweat.
So if you're building something that needs to be blazing fast and handle massive traffic.
Go is definitely worth a look. Think about the demands of something like Google Search, right?
Billions of searches every day.
Yeah.
You need some serious horsepower under the hood for that.
Exactly. And it's not just about the languages themselves. We've got this whole ecosystem of tools and services that make the modern web possible, stuff that most people don't even realize is there.
Right, like cloud computing platforms, hosting providers.
Exactly. Amazon Web Services, GoDaddy, all those players are essential. They're providing the infrastructure, the servers, the databases, the invisible stage crew that makes the whole show possible.
Okay, so back to the crystal ball. If we were to do this deep dive again in, say, 10 years, what do you think the big headlines would be?
Honestly, I think the biggest changes are going to be in how we interact with the web. Even more user-centric, even more personalized, even more integrated into our lives.
So less clicking through menus, more just the website anticipating what we need.
Right. Imagine a website that learns your preferences, knows what you're looking for, and adapts to however you want to use it.
That sounds both amazing and a little bit creepy at the same time.
They're both flat. Double-edged sword of technology, right? But it's not just about convenience. Artificial intelligence, machine learning, that stuff is already starting to change how we experience the web. And it's only going to accelerate. We're going to see way more AI-powered features, personalized recommendations, maybe even websites that can learn and adapt to your behavior in real time.
That's wild. It's exciting, for sure, but kind of makes you wonder, what new problems will we have to solve? What will web developers be grappling with 10, 20 years from now? It's a lot to think about. We started this deep dive by trying to imagine explaining today's internet to someone from 1989. Now I want you to imagine explaining the web of 2030, 2040 to yourself right now. What crazy new languages will we be speaking? What mind-blowing innovations will we be taking for granted? It makes you realize how much this field is constantly evolving. And who knows, maybe you'll be the one writing the code that powers the next chapter of the web. This has been your deep dive into the evolution of web development, from those humble beginnings to a future bursting with possibilities. We hope you learned something new, had a few aha moments of your own, and maybe even feel inspired to explore this fascinating world a bit further. Until next time, happy coding.